Now, when the DeVos administration took over, Trump term 1, they said, all right, we're not going to do this. This is not what the regulation says. It's not what it's about. We're not going to mandate these kangaroo courts, and we're not going to force kids to have to share bathrooms with kids of the opposite sex. We're just going to stop doing that.
You're watching Restoring America, where we shine a light on the fundamental values of this country and all the reasons why they're worth saving. This week, we're going to talk about the deep state and how the next conservative administration could actually use it to its advantage. I'm Kaylee McGee-White, and this is Restoring America. Former President Donald Trump frequently rails against the deep state, also known as the unelected and almost entirely unaccountable administrative state. And with good reason. Too often, bureaucrats who are almost impossible to fire and therefore act as permanent installations in the federal government, impervious to any real accountability, will advance their own agenda regardless of whether it aligns with the administration in charge. This was a hallmark feature of Trump's first term in office. For example, when former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, at Trump's direction, worked to reform Title IX and other higher education rules, she said she had to fight tooth and nail against her own employees just to release those reforms. So let's say Trump wins in November. Would a second Trump term be just like the first? Or are there ways Trump can actually use the bureaucracy and its many administrative rules to his advantage? My guest today has argued there may in fact be a way to advance a conservative agenda without draining the swamp. But before we get to him, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button, and for more, head to WashingtonExaminer.com. With me today is Max Eden, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a contributor for the Washington Examiner. Max, thanks so much for joining us. You have written a lot about the bureaucracy, specifically regulatory rules that the next conservative administration could potentially use to implement a conservative agenda, and specifically in regards to education and higher education. What are one or two of those rules that you expect the next conservative administration could take and use to their advantage?
One rule, I think the rule that's on the top of everybody's mind right now, is Title IX. Right? This is a rule or regulation that was passed in 1972 that said that no individual can be denied an education on the basis of his or her sex. And this is the regulation we have to thank for the proliferation of women's sports. And it was a regulation that wasn't controversial for a long time before the Obama administration first decided to use it to mandate kangaroo courts in colleges, and then decided to use it to mandate bathrooms by gender identity. Now, when the DeVos administration took over, Trump term 1, they said, all right, we're not going to do this. This is not what the regulation says. It's not what it's about. We're not going to mandate these kangaroo courts, and we're not going to force kids to have to share bathrooms with kids of the opposite sex. We're just going to stop doing that. The Biden administration, of course, redid it with a vengeance and is going so far using it to say, hey, you need to address somebody by whatever gender they identify with, and we're not going to tell you what a gender is because who can say what a gender is, right? So Trump term 2 could do what Trump term 1 did and simply say, we're not going to do that anymore. Or they could take Title IX and say, hey, this regulation that we have to thank for women's sports will be used to defend women's sports. And you are in violation of this regulation if you allow biological males to play women's sports. Right? We saw a gesture towards this around the end of the first Trump administration. They told Connecticut, you're out of compliance with Title IX because you're letting men play in girls' track. Now, that investigation didn't conclude, but Trump could pick it back up, and he could use that to solve the sports issue. He could also use it to go further and, solve the bathroom issue. It's against Title IX to allow children to use their sense of gender identity to determine their bathroom. That it's perfectly reasonable. In fact, schools must allocate their bathrooms by sex at birth. And they could go further than that using either Title IX or the Federal Education Privacy Rights Act and say to these schools that are currently transitioning students behind parents' backs, right? A kid comes in, girl comes in, says, I want to be addressed as a boy. School says, all right, we're going to address you as a boy, and if your parents ask, you're still a girl. They can use either Title IX or FERPA to tell all schools, if you continue to do that, you're out of compliance, you're losing federal funds.
Now, normally conservatives are wary of the bureaucracy because it is unelected, it's largely unaccountable. What is the argument for using the bureaucracy as it exists to advance conservatism versus, let's say, draining the swamp entirely and trying to get rid of a lot of these people and agencies?
Yeah, I mean, I would be totally supportive of getting rid of the Department of Education. That is not something the Republican Party actually has supported in practice, right? People make a big deal of, oh, Trump's running on abolishing the Department of Education. Well, Trump ran on that in 2016 too. And when Betsy DeVos tried to cut funding by a very small amount, about 5%, she got just raked over the coals by Republicans. It wasn't just that the Democrats went up in arms and the vote failed on party lines. Republicans tore into her in committee hearings, and it was a huge black eye in her administration. So if you're not going to get rid of it, then the question is, do you just try to pare it back and tame it, or do you try to use it? And for many years, I think the stock conservative answer was, we shouldn't be aggressive with these tools, because if we do this onto them, they will do it back onto us, and they'll do it onto us twice as hard. I think that argument's fallen out of favor. I think
they're already doing it.
And they will do more of it anyway, and trust me, they are not looking to conservative education policy lawyers for novel, brilliant ideas of what else they can do. They know what they want to do, and they will do it regardless. And so the argument that's carrying favor right now is, okay, if there's any hope at de-escalation, then you get to de-escalation through escalation. And you do that, maybe at the end of the day they stop trying to use these tools to advance the agenda, or maybe you reach a better policy stasis by, instead of just preventing them from moving the ball from the 40 to the 30 or trying to move it back to the 50, you try to run it up to the 60 so that they have to get 20 yards back to get to where they started rather than 10 yards back and get more terrain of the next play around.
One of the other concerns that you've already mentioned is that, let's say the next conservative administration takes your advice and uses the bureaucracy to aggressively regulate in conservatism's favor. What if the next Democratic administration then comes in and undoes all of the good that's been done by, let's say, the next Trump administration? What are some ways that conservatives can make these changes permanent? Is it only legally through Congress, or can some of these regulations actually permanently hold past just 4 years of a conservative administration?
Some of them can hold, and it'll be kind of a very interesting decision if and when the Trump administration gets control of the Department of Education, starts to govern what balls they choose to play, right? So as one example, one thing the Department of Education effectively controls is college accreditation, right? In order for colleges to receive Title IV federal funds, they need to be accredited, and the Department of Education has legal authority to oust accreditors that currently exist and to accept new accreditors, right? And so if the Department of Education were to try to oust current accreditors, which is part of the Agenda 47 Trump platform, which I think would be legally difficult, but would be possible, or if it puts on new accreditors, allows new accreditors to enter and authorizes them, those accreditors will start to authorize colleges, and then there'll be a substantial reliance interest such that if and when a Democratic Department of Education wants to cut back on it, they'll be actively possibly destroying institutions, and it would be kind of very sticky in that way. The other thing that the Trump administration can do, and you're seeing part of it play out, is use the regulatory process rather than Dear Colleague letters, or in addition to Dear Colleague letters, right? So the Biden Department of Education spent the better part of 3 years trying to implement their Title IX regulation, and once it was implemented, they were sued by more than half the states in the union, and it seems reasonably likely that that will be stopped in court. And so there'll be other areas where the Trump administration can similarly kind of try to make a hard regulation that, yeah, they will come at it and they will try to undo it, and they might. And you might lose at the end of the day, but you will gain at least a few years more of governance under the regulation that you have put down, and you also kind of try to lay adequate legal landmines so that when they try to undo regulation and overdo it with errors, as they certainly will, that those can get stopped. And so if and when the courts stop the Title IX regulation, for example, it will go back to the DeVos regulation. It's not going to go back to zero. That would be the result of their, I think at this point, anticipated loss. And so there'll be other areas where regulations, aggressive regulations, will breed an effort from the next Democratic administration to get even more aggressive, right? And because they're kind of using the tools that you've used, and because they're trying to punch back twice as hard, they actually become legally vulnerable.
Well, let's just hope there is a next conservative administration to take advantage of this strategy. Thanks so much for joining. And for more breaking news, exclusive interviews, and conservative views, be sure to check out WashingtonExaminer.com.